Hi everyone, my name's Friedrich, but you can call me Fred, and today I'm going to be talking about why the ending of so many fantasy series suck. That's a pretty clickbaity intro, I'm sorry about that. Let's clear up what I'm talking about. So I'm going to be looking at fantasy, which I'm going to include under the umbrella some bonus stuff like paranormal, urban fantasy type things, as well as dystopian and some of the more personal sci-fi I think this can also apply to. So I guess it's kind of a spec fic look, but I don't want to say speculative fiction as a whole because I'm not super familiar with hard sci-fi, and I know a lot of that is less character-based, and a lot of this discussion is going to be character-based. And horror usually has the audience looking for a different kind of closure, where it's a lot about the reveal and the aftermath and finding out what exactly happened or what exactly the cause is, which is a lot different to the hero's journey, which is the thing I'm going to be looking at today, wherein we follow a protagonist, which may be one of multiple POV characters, who has gone from a baseline normalcy, even if that normalcy sucks or is weird to the reading audience, a baseline normalcy to them, and gone through like huge amounts of struggles that enter the underworld phase 2 bit to end up saving the world or completely changing it, or going through something huge and momentous in a fantasy context, which usually involves at least one dragon. I know this is a pretty specific storyline, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with the fact that it makes up a hell of a lot of fantasy as well as other stories. But fantasy is like my expertise, and then it's the only thing I ever read. So I'm going to be narrowing my focus to speculative fiction. So I'm going to be narrowing my focus to just, like I said, the previous fantasy umbrella. Because fantasy is my thing, I've noticed this tendency in quite a few stories. I'm going to be looking at just two specifically today. Partially because I don't want to spoil some lesser known books, and partially just to keep a narrow focus by looking at some more well-known examples. Pretty much the vast majority of my favourite books tend to follow the hero's journey type setup, which is why it pisses me off so much when the ending, is unsatisfying. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, unsatisfying endings. Not just ones I dislike personally, although I'm sure there are quite a few people out there who do like the endings that I mentioned. I would like to offer some textual evidence as to why I find these endings don't do the narrative justice, and it's less of a personal nitpick, less of a, oh, he should have dated that other girl type thing, more of looking at like what makes the narrative work and why the ending failed to do so. So let's start with the same series that most people's love of fantasy did, Harry Potter. So many people hate this epilogue. It's probably like the one thing that everyone agrees on reading the Harry Potter series. I have seen arguments for and against everything in this series, but the one thing that I have seen the most balanced is people who hate the epilogue versus people who like the epilogue, which is like two guys. And there's a very good reason why so many people hate this epilogue, and that's because it encapsulates so many of the reasons why heroes' journey endings tend to fail. What's going on here? Is this one okay? This one's fine. What happened to this one? The Deathly Hallows epilogue sees Harry and his friends, happily married with beautiful, loving children, standing on the platform 9 3/4 as said children head off onto the Hogwarts Express, the very same train where the Golden Trio met all those years ago. This sounds like a nice enough scene, but it comes exactly 6 pages after Harry Potter stood in the wreckage of the one place he had called home and murdered a man who had ruined his entire life. There is 6 pages between Harry saving the entire world at incredible great expense to himself personally and to the world itself at age 17, and him standing on a platform happily married as a good and loving father at age 36. The final line of the book assures us that all is well, as if that is a truth that we the audience are ready to accept. As if that is a truth that Harry Potter would ever feel safe accepting. Harry was nearly murdered as a literal infant and then spent his formative years enduring a cavalcade of traumas and humiliation, but all is well. He's happy, he's in a secure marriage to his childhood sweetheart, he's a wizard cop, he's got 3 children named after his dead parents whose ages suggest that he had the first one at age 24. These are two completely different people, these Harry Potters. J.K. Rowling deliberately portrays Harry as struggling immensely under the weight of being the chosen one as a teenager, and then all of that weight and struggle just disappears. It's gone. Everything that Harry went through, everything he struggled with, everything that was difficult for him is gone. And yeah, we get a sense that it took a hell of a lot to achieve this piece, but it's just so total. Does this piece even feel accessible when the person who sacrificed the most to get it doesn't even feel affected by the journey? This whole epilogue feels like a dream Harry has. It feels like something he hopes to someday achieve but knows he can't, or at least that it's going to be super hard for him, or that it's going to not be as great as it looks. Like, the most conflict we get in this is that the kid with the worst name in the world is scared of being a Slither, and there's no insight to Harry's difficulties in settling down and raising a family. Remember that Harry and Hermione and all the other Muggle-born kids, and even like the young pureblood kids, only knew the Wizarding World in the context of war, or in that like brief interlude between two wars when it's like kind of rebuilding. Are we safe yet? I'm not sure. All of our parents are directly traumatized by the effect of being in combat. And can you imagine how difficult it would be to settle into a secure, happy life in that world when the only way you've ever known it is it being plagued by fear? Can you imagine getting a government job in that kind of world? How do they even know what the Wizarding World looks like at a time of peace? How do they know what the government needs? Like, what are the issues that were like buried under the shadow of Voldemort that now come to the fore now that they're at peace and everybody can just calm down? Like, what are the goblin rights? Like, spew. Like, is that like a legit issue that just wasn't addressed at the moment because everyone was like, oh my gosh, there are like literal murders everywhere? What's the wizard budget look like? And is that their responsibility? Why would you put them in the government? They don't know anything about government. They were vigilantes for like all of book 7. That was the point. All they've ever known is war, and suddenly they're all in these perfect ideal nuclear families? No! This upsets me. The lack of respect for my boy Harry and all of his comrades. It upsets me. The second case study epilogue that we're going to be discussing today in class. Where'd my lips go? The second famous epilogue that I'm going to be looking at today is that of the Hunger Games. And I have seen quite a few people complain about this, but not to the extent to which they complain about the Harry Potter epilogue. And the complaints that I have seen are usually about the fact that she got with Peter instead of with Gale. And if that's your gripe, I mean, sure, fine. I mean, we all have ships that didn't end up canon and it's sad, but there's more. The point of the epilogue isn't to establish that Peter and Katniss ended up in a romantic relationship. That much is established already in like the last 2 lines of the last proper chapter. The point of the epilogue is to establish that they had children together. And it bugs me, dude! Katniss specifically says that it took her 15 years to be convinced by Peter to have children, and there are several things about this statement. It took her 15 years of deliberation and discussion with her husband, and we don't see a single bit of that. We don't see any of Peter's points. We don't see any of Katniss's reticence. We don't see any of like her interactions with like Annie's kid and like thinking about the future and like how she could be a caretaker. Like, there's no examples of her thinking about being a parent. It's just we see her as entering a relationship with Peter, and then we see her several years into being a mother. And the fact that Peter convinced her, this phrasing is a little bad. I'm choosing to interpret it as like a thing, you know, where you're in a marriage and you both have different wants and needs and you're trying to balance it and you have like a discussion about it, and in the end Katniss realizes that yeah, maybe she can be a mother because Peter wants nothing more than to be a father, but like we don't get any of this nuance. We don't. But having Katniss's perspective and not having seen Peter's interest in being a father gives it this kind of lack of weight. Like, we don't see the evenness between it. We don't see the fact that like Katniss was less afraid to be a parent than Peter was excited to be a parent. We don't get that balance. But just the fact that Peter would want kids either. The whole point of the series is how intrinsically their trauma is tied to them being children. Like, the biggest theme of the books is how the suffering of children can be weaponized as a propaganda weapon. An entire nation can be demoralized into complacency when its entertainment is their own children dying. And Katniss did everything she could to protect her little sister's childhood and innocence. Katniss gave up, she was willing to die for Prim to have like some semblance of a childhood. And she failed. Prim died. And we really don't get the kind of inner turmoil that would create in Katniss in thinking of her ever being a caregiver ever again. I just can't see her feeling comfortable as a mother after Prim's death. And yeah, it's been 15 years since Prim died that Katniss decides to be a mother, but it hasn't been 15 years for the audience. If we look at the book, Katniss is still inconsolable about Prim's death 3 pages before the epilogue begins. And in 3 pages, the audience is expected to go from seeing Katniss at her absolute emotional lowest point, where she feels like everything has been for naught, to being happy as a mother. And I will give it props in that we aren't expected to see Katniss as like this perfect mom who never has any problems the way we kind of are with Harry. And I mean, it's like, yeah, we get like the implication that they might have problems sometimes, the Potter family, but like I said, the biggest one we see is that Albus Severus is afraid of being a Slytherin, and not that like, my parents grew up as child soldiers. We get the sense that like Katniss is having nightmares. She specifically says that she's having nightmares, and that one day she'll have to explain them to her kids, and she's feeling kind of nervous about that. But in the end, she reaches that kind of emotional plateau where it's like, yeah, I'm still struggling from the war, but also I have kids now. 3 pages. We don't see this slow reapproach to childhood and caregiving roles that Katniss obviously has over the course of 15 years. We don't see any of it. For Katniss, we see more of the effects of trauma than we did for Team Hogwarts, but in the end, she still reaches that same final plateaued stage of personhood to which all great heroes must aspire: straight marriage and parenthood.
Hey, wait a second. Is this just you being a bitter lesbian?
A little bit. I mean, it is pretty telling that gay characters are never the POV characters in these kind of stories. They're always a side character who gets to have like one romantic interest or like a moment to themselves, but the big gay kiss is never the emotional climax of the series or anything like that, and they don't get to settle down in the end to have like the 5 kids and the happily ever after. They're usually just either they die for tragedy or they're like the offsider as usual, and we never get to see the huge emotional growth that the same protagonist gets to go through. I'm a little bitter. But it's more than just that. This doesn't service to heterosexual characters as well, as it continues to perpetuate this myth that there's only one kind of happily ever after, only one way it can all end when the war's over. That your success in all other areas not only guarantees, but is kind of dependent on you becoming someone else's spouse and someone else's parent. That these are the pinnacle of your relationships, and your mentor, your sidekick, your blood brothers, your siblings, your saved dad, your dead mom, and even your villains, they just don't matter when put up next to your kids who are in the book for 2 pages. They're all just a build-up to your white picket fence and blue-eyed babies. I feel like this is starting to sound like some classic I don't need no man brand type feminism, and yeah. But while I am trying to push back against that narrative of women being spouses and mothers above all else, I also am not a fan of the kind of trauma recovery narrative that this whole thing is pushing. And the hero's journey really is a journey of trauma, like almost always. One of the steps is called Journey to the Underworld, for goodness sake. So I mean, that doesn't sound terrifying, but it often includes a character becoming a murderer, or at least a fighter against their will and moral compass, and going to great terrifying lengths for a cause that they often don't really understand completely. Like, take Eragon, for example. This thing is so by the book, it's hilarious. Let me get Eragon.
I'm sorry. I forgot I gave Aragon to a charity shop, so I don't have a physical copy of Aragon. But we're going to talk about Aragon now.
Yeah, so, Aragon. The mentor you rely on to navigate the world, that bitch is dead. Your love interest, in danger with very little time to actually enjoy your courtship. Your hometown, ashes. Your ass, always on the run. Your best friends, a paramilitary group of fighters who always end up dying right in front of you, violently, screaming with nothing you can do. This is straight up war trauma. And for a lot of people coming from that kind of trauma, they can't transition to a safe and stable nuclear family, at least not very easily, and not very quickly. That's not a you will never heal type thing, it's just that how people heal, what they end up as after they've healed, what they choose to do with their lives after the war, it doesn't always look like apple pies on a windowsill and PTA meeting. That's something that the Aragon series actually did pretty right, and that's in letting Aragon himself stay as an adventurer. After the whole business with, what was his name, Galbatorix? I don't know, it was dumb. After the series, Aragon fucked off to lands unknown with his cool elf wife and got to continue being an explorer and finding out new shit and learning about dragons and elves and magic and all the stuff that he liked doing. And that's a good ending. When I was younger, when I was like 16 or however I was the last one, Eldest? When the last one came out, the only thing I didn't like about that ending was the fact that I didn't get to see these lands unknown, but you know, that's kind of like a teenage curiosity type thing, and Christopher Paolini is only so passable. But it's consistent with Aragon's character. I mean, he was always asking questions about how the world works, where the dragons came from, where they went, why magic happens, and so it makes perfect sense for him to go on a quest for knowledge. The end of the Farseer trilogy is also pretty good in this respect. Obviously, the wider realm of the Elderling series continued on into the Lifeship Traders trilogy, but Fitz himself didn't show up again for like 16 in-story years. He ends the Farseer trilogy knowing that if he goes back to Buckkeep, he'll have to be a spy again, and not even for his beloved Uncle Verity. He trusts Ketchikan with the throne, he knows she's a good leader, and then he's like, well, I guess it's my turn to decide who I am, and fucks off into the wilderness with his wolf. He gets to see the world, to learn more of the magic he was forced to keep repressed, and we as the audience get a definite sense of freedom that comes with that ending. He doesn't have to kill and lie and spy and cheat for the crown anymore. He just gets to be his own person, existing, living his life, seeing the world, smelling the sun, being partially a wolf. It's amazing. A key aspect of why these "and the journey continues" type endings work so much better than the "I am a perfectly normal and happy citizen" endings is due to a trope called the tether cat principle, also known as off-screen inertia. Boils down to a character is probably still doing what they were last seen doing unless indicated otherwise. It's the narrative version of that whole if an object in motion continues to stay in motion unless acted against with a large enough force. This applies most readily to things like, say, in one scene a character falls down a well and the next time they show up they're completely fine and they're not even wet and you're just like, hey, how the fuck did you get out of that well? But it also applies to a character's emotional states and thoughts. It's a pretty strong rule that forces of change have to be depicted or at least alluded to in some way, even if it's like out of narrative order. Otherwise the audience doesn't get a sense of the fullness of the story, and to them it just looks like shit's changing for no reason. And the happy parent endings don't really leave room for continued emotional change and growth. That's not to say that your life ends when you become a parent, it's just that the way it's depicted in books like Hunger Games and Harry Potter, it looks like the end, emotionally, for these characters. They've shown us Harry and Katniss right after making huge emotional decisions with no insight into what the next problem will be, no ongoing struggle, and yeah, with Katniss you get the sense that like eventually she'll have to tell her kids why she's traumatized, but you don't get a sense of like how their relationship evolves out of that, how Katniss's own views towards the war evolve from that, and it just kind of stops. Like, being a parent is all they were ever going to be. Books end, but people don't. Even when the series ends with the main character or characters dying, the world still moves on without them. And in a good book, you get a sense of how their death has affected people and the world. A book that stays with you is a book you can continue thinking about. And for a whole series, the protagonist has been our window to that world. Even if it's from a third-person POV, they're still basically our guide and our measuring stick for how the world works. So when the protagonist stops, so does the world. And so does our interest. If you would like to see a deconstruction of this type of happily ever after, I cannot recommend Ursula Le Guin's Te Hanu enough. The protagonist is Tēnā, one of the damsel in distresses of an earlier Earthsea book, and at the end of that book, the second one, The Tombs of Atawan, she is rescued by Ged, and he brings her home to the city of Havnor, where she is safe and happy, and the streets are clean and sparkling, and everything is going to be just fine for her. The book Te Hanu picks up like over a decade later, 2 decades later. She's married to some villager. She's got adult children. She's got mountains of domestic chores. She's got her own property to manage. And she still has the heart and soul of a fantasy protagonist, trapped in a pretty simple life. The previous narrative abandoned her after she served her usefulness to the plot. Te Hanu picks her up and puts her straight back on her feet and lets her continue her own story. It is phenomenal. And if you'd like to see a series that has what I think a very satisfying version of the Heteros Ever After narrative, I would recommend, once again, The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb, specifically the Live Ship Trader trilogy. Don't worry, that one can be viewed as like totally standalone, just those 3 books make perfect sense, and obviously they tie into the wider narrative of Realm of the Elderlings, but you don't need to know what happened in the books before or the books after to have a completely satisfying and standalone story. It has several point of view characters, one of whom ends up happily married to a guy who she initially hated. And if you just said that to me, I'd be like, that sounds like my least favorite type of narrative. But it actually feels amazing to get to that end. You really get a sense that she's grown and become a much better person. And from the reader's perspective, it feels like a victory. If you look at the Goodreads page for these 3 books, the Live Ship Trader trilogy, in book 1, all of everyone's reviews are just like, man, I hate Malta, she's such a brat. And in book 2, everyone's reviews are like, oh my gosh, am I liking Malta? And the book 3 reviews are all just like, Malta, I love you, I'm so proud of you, my daughter. And like, that's how it feels. It's like the best character development I have ever seen. And her marriage at the end to this guy feels like the culmination of her character development. It's fantastic. Her learning to love this guy despite her initial prejudices and coming to see that the marriage can be beneficial both politically and emotionally fulfilling to her is fantastic. You get a really strong sense of her maturing and growing into this role, and the best bit about the ending is that you definitely get a sense that more is going to happen. You get a sense that through this marriage, which like it ends with them like, I don't know if they officially get married or they officially get betrothed or like, you know, they're married. It ends with that, and then it just opens up all these opportunities and you're like, oh man, they're going to change everything about the trading town. They're going to change everything about how these resources are like spread around the world. They're going to change everything about the approach to the dragons and the elderlings, and everything's going to be different because of this marriage, and everything's going to be different because of Malta, and everything's going to be different and better and interesting, and there's so much more for this world to offer, and it is a really cool ending, and I cannot recommend it highly enough, but I say that about all of the Realm of the Elderlings. Malta Vestrit's story is probably my favorite example of an emotional coming-of-age story, and it's the B-plot to a book about dragon fetuses. I love it. So basically my point boils down to that of emotional stagnation. It doesn't really matter what you do with your ending, it's if it provides more. You know, as long as you give your readers a sense that the story continues, that the world continues more importantly, and that the characters are still alive and developing as people, then you have a pretty good ending on your hands, no matter like what form it takes. The thing with the marriage and the children is that it seems to be the most common one. So many of these stories have romances as B-plots, like I mentioned with Malta's. The ending of the story obviously has like all the plot threads come together and you want to see how the romance ends. Are they happy together? And after so many books of them like dancing around each other and doing things for each other, like a lot of the time the audience wants them to be happy together. But what that happiness looks like needs to be something real and alive and genuinely in love, and not just an excuse to push out a sequel about the babies. So let me know if you agreed with me, particularly regarding the Harry Potter and Hunger Games epilogues. I nearly said prologues. Epilogues. Did you find them as dull as flat and I did? Did you find them bad for different reasons? Did you actually like them? Did you feel like there was an energy in them that maybe I missed? And Tell me if you have examples of endings that work really well, if you have examples of endings that work terribly, because I do love reading horror books and laughing at them. And just let me know of what your favourite kind of ending, that would be cool too. Thanks so much for listening to me.